Not everyone should be in a relationship. Some people are hurt and need to focus on their healing. If somebody broke their leg, no one would have any problem benching that person. That person is no longer on the starting lineup. And everyone is also replaceable.
It's not going to be super easy. Nobody's going to sit there and wait for me to slowly grow that over a period of, say, 6 months. That person is going to have their own needs and demands, and she's going to need also things from me that I cannot give. I think this is the place where a lot of men get stuck. How do you help them get out of that stage, start learning how to properly have these relationships when they actually can't sustain a normal relationship, but nobody's going to tolerate them while they're quote-unquote weak?
Are you addicted to your relationship? Are you only with the person that you're with because you think you can't get any better? Today we're bringing on Dr. Orion Taraban to discuss not only his book, a very controversial book called The Value of Others, but also all those hidden factors that are guiding you through the relationships that you wish you weren't in. Let's tune in. Dr. Orion, welcome to the show. Dr. Orion, thank you for coming back. Our first episode was incredible, and people have demanded that you return. They had asked me so many times to talk with you in the first place anyway. You're my number one most requested collaborator, so thank you for spending the time to be back with us. After the last podcast, you sent me a signed copy of your book, and I would love to dig into a lot more of that. You've made quite some waves online with things that people are uncomfortable about, but I happen to think that you're right.
I have a question for you, Dr. Ryan. How do you know what is it that you truly want and need in a relationship in this case?
That's very difficult to know. I think that it's hard to know what we truly want. That could be an onion that has many different layers as we dive deeper into our experience. I think we have a general idea of what we consciously desire, and that seems to be the target that we place in the external world that we move towards. The really frustrating and difficult thing about relationships is that what we want and need changes as a function of time, and also as a function of getting what we want. This is one of the things that makes relationships so difficult in the long term. Basically, I move towards you because I sense that you have what I want. But if you give it to me, then on some level, I don't need you as much as I previously did. And so by satisfying my need or desire, you've undermined the basis of our relationship. The metaphor I use in the book is no one continues to pay the plumber, in the sense that the plumber is in very high demand when the toilet is backed up, but after the problem has been solved, no one continues to pay that guy. He goes on his way. And so this is a very difficult line to walk, because if I get the sense that I can never get what I want or need from you, I might put up with it for a while, but eventually I'm going to get frustrated and take my ball and go home. But if you give me everything that I want and need right away, then on some level you're complicit in making yourself obsolete. And I'm only going to continue to relate to you if I have a deep, abiding love or friendship for you, which are, let's put it mildly, rare. They take time and to develop those types of relationships, and they're really developed for their own inscrutable reasons and given from the free and spontaneous will of the givers with no strings attached. It's not something that we can really count on in the vast majority of cases. Versus people who don't love each other and aren't friends with each other can still manage to, on some level, do business with each other. Just like you don't even have to like your coworkers in order to get done.
It's true. Now, there's one thing that actually does play out interestingly in relationships that do have a long and good standing history of transactionality. That is, hey, I have a need. For example, Adam and I have a need for each other, right? We're on this podcast together. We have business relationships. We have developed friend relationships. But on top of that, we've developed a set of habits that is creating a pleasant experience for both of us to deal with each other. We actually enjoy the process of exchanging these transactions and providing goods and services to each other. So if I was presented with a similar Adam, maybe you'll be wearing a blue suit as opposed to a gray suit and I could switch, I wouldn't, because this specific unit in front of me is the one that delivers me the most safety, stability, and I'm used to him. It's like that toothbrush that you finally break it in and it's just your toothbrush now. No offense, Adam.
Very little taken.
Well, at least some, apparently.
I was recently urged to replace my toothbrush after too much use. So that's the other side of it too, is they do get kind of crusty after a while.
What if it
No
was a
offense.
renewable toothbrush? Would you still replace it?
I don't know. Is anything permanently renewable? That's interesting to
Yeah.
consider. I have kind of the belief that everyone is unique, as you put it. Adam is Adam, and you get whatever unique dynamic that arises out of your mutual presence. And everyone is also replaceable. Like the things that we're talking about, people have spoken about before, and people are going to continue to talk about long after we're gone. They won't have the exact flavor and timbre of our conversation, and that's what we bring to the table. But there's nothing new under the sun, as they say.
Is it possible in the sentimentality of connecting with human beings? Is it possible that through exchanging oxytocin, exchanging vasopressin, the bonding hormones, those neurotransmitters, the serotonin, the dopamine, and whatnot, could we be putting each other on subscription models? Could that be what lovers do and why they stay together monogamously for lifelong? You're on a subscription model with each other, so you can't disconnect because you won't find it adequately anywhere else, or at least it would be difficult to find it somewhere else without interruption.
Yeah, and I do talk about that using the Netflix model is kind of one of the best ways to get involved in a relationship in 2025, which is, it's actually kind of ironic because I don't think Netflix does this anymore. Someone told me this recently. But the idea is you give people a free trial where they get access to your entire product, no strings attached. Here it is. We have high quality entertainment and shows. And the idea, of course, is that the viewer will take that time to get emotionally invested in one or more programs. They want to get hooked on that unique content, and it has to be content that you can't get on Hulu or Peacock or all the other platforms that are out there. And then as the months go by and that hook digs deeper, that's when they hit you with, so are you ready to upgrade to the premium subscription? Of course, if the hook isn't set emotionally before that time, and or that content is not unique to that platform, most people are going to balk at paying for something that they used to receive for free. But I don't think that in today's day and age, you can demand that people, let's say, even buy a subscription in order to just see what kind of content you have to offer. I think that would be a tough sell. I might actually go even a step further and explain what you did a little bit more cynically. That what you're talking about is kind of, let's say, a healthy addiction, especially since you're talking about oxytocin and other endogenously produced chemicals, is that we could perhaps more cynically say is that we create kind of a habituation to the experience that we have in a person's presence. And then we suffer withdrawal symptoms when we're deprived of that person for an extended period of time. And so we have to re-up for our own kind of emotional equilibrium and well-being.
That's not really controversial at all. Actually, that's completely accurate. When you look at our brains, for example, anyone who's not avoidantly attached, any other attachment styles, including secure, there's a part of your brain that detects being truly isolated socially and equates it to danger. And it says, I am now in danger. I need to connect with other people. So you're compelled to go out and seek intimate connection with others. Oxytocin, if it's low, we get low GABA, our immune system crashes, our hormones crash. We must be getting these things and co-regulating with other humans. It's not really a choice. So it's a forced subscription model, like car insurance, for example. You don't have much of a choice there usually either. So we are compelled to do that. Now we have to seek out people who are going to transact fairly with us. And that's my work with attachment issues, is helping people actually build a transaction that's mutually fulfilling and actually beneficial for them, not playing at a deficit or playing secret games either.
Sure, but that could also be considered a health optimization, right? So we're okay with picking up a whole bunch of vitamins and going on vitamin stacks. We're okay with making good nutritional decisions and turning that into a habit, or picking up good exercise routines and then sticking to them for life. In essence, are we not optimizing ourselves from a biochemical level when it comes to relationships in a similar way?
Yeah, I heard an interesting quote from Alex Hormozy the other day. He said that health is getting better addictions. And I agree. Just like you said, I mean, we might not really have a choice but to relate to others, but we can certainly choose who we become addicted to on some level. And some people are addicted to the kind of process that occurs in trauma bonding and dysfunctional on again, off again relationships. And some people are addicted to secure, peaceful partners. And it's like we get to choose where our addictions lie, but we may not get to choose to be addicted to begin with, because that we cannot live apart from other people, and we can't, on some level, prevent forming an attachment.
So could we romanticize potentially this addictive process? Because in essence, the idea of falling in love and creating loyalty, building friendships, that itself has its own value. Would you agree?
Yeah, it's certainly much nicer to call it falling in love than becoming addicted to your own oxytocin
I'm chemically
generation.
dependent on you, sir.
Yes, yes, yeah, that is, and that's the biggest thing I see of people going against you is people that just simply feel deeply uncomfortable that you're revealing the biochemistry underneath and the transactionality of what's actually happening. They don't want the magic stripped away. They don't want to see how the hot dog is made. They just want the hot dog to magically appear and be delicious. That's the biggest complaint I seem to see.
Well, we
Would
can
you
even
agree?
consider it kind of a folk metaphor. It's like the idea of vasopressin and oxytocin those are very modern concepts. So how did people explain the feelings of those processes in the past? And so they developed metaphors to talk about them. And then those metaphors got reified over time.
Absolutely true.
So there's a process then to reintegrate properly into healthy habits, just as one would turn back from an unhealthy lifestyle with food or with exercise or lack thereof. So there's probably a proper process then to reintegrate into a healthy neurotransmitter lifestyle. So I'm curious from the perspective of men, because I know you've been talking a lot to men on your channel recently, Dr. Orion, and building healthy habits. Where should you start if you don't really have any healthy habits at all when it comes to relationships?
Yeah, that's a tough one because there's sure a lot of people out there who don't have healthy habits. I was one of them in my younger years. And I think just like if we're talking about a different type of healthy habit, whether you're abusing drugs or certain types of foods or et cetera, is you have to stop doing the bad thing first. Is that you might have to stop using the substance. You might have to stop and abstain consciously from those types of relationships that you feel most compelled to enter into. Just like a recovering addict in those early stages of recovery feels still very drawn to his drug of choice. If I told you to do 10 good things, but you were still involved in the dysfunctional relationships, that one thing is going to cancel out all the good that might come from the 10 new habits that you're attempting to form. So the first thing is to stop doing what hurts you, to stop doing the bad thing, as it were. And that can be very difficult, especially because if you're used to unhealthy relationships, even if you were to, say, break up with your current drama partner and try to enter into a relationship with somebody who's more stable or securely attached, you're going to find it to be very boring and unsatisfying, in the same way that addicts without their drugs find life to be intolerably dull or painful. And that could be part of the withdrawal. Like, I don't know if there's a way around that. That said, it shouldn't last forever. And I think that we can and should, in most cases, expand our capacity to grow in the direction of who we would like to become. So, for example, if somebody is involved in dysfunctional relationships that are very high drama or chaotic, this person might have an unaccepted, an unacknowledged need for excitement. Now, there's a few different ways that you can get that need met that don't require getting involved in unstable, explosive relationships, and it might be better to get that need met in those ways. But even then, it's a tough sell to then get into a calm, peaceful, stable relationship. But that's the work, is that the work is to put yourself in those contexts and to manage increasingly the discomfort that comes up in you for longer periods of time. I call that the emotional gym. And just like you don't really get to grow a muscle until you really start to move towards failure, when your muscles really start to give out, on some level, you don't grow your emotional capacity until you're challenged to that point where you feel like you're about to lose your mind on some level. And that's you becoming stronger and more resilient in a psychological way, just like working towards failure is you building health and strength in a muscular way.
I know that a lot of the people watching this show right now have had attachment issues for their entire life. That's why I want to invite every single one of you to check out my attachment repair program. It just might be the jump that you need to go from insecurely attached and lonely and frustrated to fully secure, connected, and bonded in a great relationship like nothing you've ever felt before. Check out my website, adamlanesmith.com, for the attachment repair program.
So, Adam, how do we recognize an emotional addict or maybe yet a relationship addict?
Well, the difference between a person who eats good, clean food and benefits from the nutrition and a person who is doing heroin in the corner and destroying their life usually is it long-term beneficial to them? It's the exchange of short-term for long-term destruction. I get something pleasurable in the short term, ultimate destruction long term. That's usually how we start classifying addictions. That's why we don't call prescription medication addictions, because we don't like to talk about it that way. But a lot of them have
Bad
long-term
marketing.
destructive things. It's bad marketing, right? Yeah, we just take a pill and forget about it. But food is medicine. Food can be an addiction. Dopamine is certainly addictive if you don't have other biochemicals to balance it out. Dopamine, if that's all that you feel that you have left. Dopamine is massively addictive, leads to gambling addiction, even romance addiction, sex addiction behaviors. So all of those are often predicated on having an absence of other pieces, usually, quite often.
Yeah, we call those process addictions. So it doesn't seem like they're from the outside that they're chemical addictions because no one's ingesting a substance. The chemical is endogenous, it's coming from inside the person, and these can be even more difficult to break. But fortunately, to kind of extend your analogy there, Adam, fortunately for all of us, is that our tastes can change. Maybe in the beginning, it's the choice between the icky broccoli and the warm embrace of heroin, but as we begin to change our health and our choices and our addictions and our habits, then the broccoli starts to taste better and the heroin doesn't feel as good as it used to. So people's tastes change to reflect their level of health or maybe even their level of consciousness.
And the brain will release dopamine in accordance with what is helpful and beneficial over time. If when you encounter broccoli, you seem to get very little benefit from it, your brain won't tell you, oh, hey, this felt good, remember this. As over time, as you see the benefit of it, you benefit from it. This is why people flock to supplements. You take a couple supplements, you start to feel better, you say, oh, it must be the supplement. Ding, you get a little dopamine release, and your brain says, remember my supplement. And then you start saying, I want more supplements. And you start tweaking and improving and stacking. And that is a positive element of it. Relationships are the same. If you are chasing wildly chaotic partners who are overloading you with sexual intimacy at the very beginning, and then burning your house down 3 weeks in, and that's your type, you are benefiting from it, and you are transacting with them, getting exactly what you actually want. It's changing what you actually want by analyzing it and then pursuing someone else in a different transaction that really is going to get you the benefits.
Okay. But then in this case, there's also an element of pacing, right? So if I'm just getting started on my journey, and in order for me to be in a fully fulfilling transactional relationship and healthy transactional relationship, say with a female, I'm going to have pretty large emotional muscles. It's not going to be super easy. Nobody's going to sit there and wait for me to slowly grow that over a period of, say, 6 months. That person is going to have their own needs and demands, and she's going to need also things from me that I cannot give. I think this is the place where a lot of men get stuck. So how do you help them get out of that stage, start learning how to properly have these relationships when they actually can't sustain a normal relationship, but nobody's going to tolerate them while they're quote unquote weak?
Yeah, it's tough. I say that not everyone should be in a relationship. I mean, some people are hurt and need to focus on their healing. Like if somebody broke their leg, no one would have any problem benching that person. That person is no longer on the starting lineup. That person's going to sit on the bench, do some PT, get healthy, get strong, and then he's going to get back in the game. But to kind of assume that you can have a broken leg and start on the team, that's unreasonable. But a lot of people don't see emotional or psychological wounds or injuries on the same level as a broken femur, for better or for worse. So I do think that maybe that person doesn't need to be in a relationship for a while, but the and to focus on understanding himself and his processes and potentially healing those wounds. Maybe he's in therapy. It worked for me to help move in this direction. I think it works for a lot of people. But there's also a point at which you have to get better at relationships by being in relationships. So that's the other flip side of it is you can't really get better at it by reading a book or watching some YouTube videos. You have to be in it.
You got to take the actual supplement. as opposed to just read about the supplement.
Mm.
Yeah.
And if you try your best and it's still not good enough, and your partner says, I can't wait around for you, you're not where I want you to be, then that's feedback. And maybe you got a little bit further than you did the last time. And is that woman any worse? She was probably there because she saw that man as her perceived best option. If she had a better option at that time, she would have been pursuing that. So maybe she needs to look at that as well.
So I'm kind of curious then around this idea of men getting together into groups. There's a lot of masculinity groups that are out there that are starting to form and get quite popular, I would say. Online groups, church groups. There's AA groups. There's all sorts of groups where men seem to come together and they're starting to simulate that experience for each other, but in a much more controlled way than they would in a romantic relationship.
I got to experience this actually with Dr. Orion's group. You have a fantastic men's group, and that was a delight that I got to go in there and speak to them. It was wonderful watching them share and bond with each other and grow those relationships. So yeah, that's true.
It is a great community. It's not technically a men's community. We do have a number of women in there, but they are the minority. I wish we had more.
Oh. Is there something stopping women from joining groups like that, you think?
I don't know. I think most of the people in the community are coming from my audience. My audience is 85% male, so it's roughly proportional to the gender split in my YouTube audience.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. We're actually seeing a fascinating shift in Adam's audience away from males towards females. As soon as we started touching a lot of the subjects around like avoidant attachment and just relationship recovery from avoidant factors. So we've seen a crazy shift, and we've seen a very interesting set of behaviors where women tend to invest a lot of time and energy learning from Adam and from us and the podcast and everybody we bring on, then reapplying that experience to their partners and then trying to loop their partners back into this healing process. I've never really understood that from the perspective of transactionality, because it seems that once they figure out how broken the system is, why should they continue to pursue that person as opposed to take everything they've learned and find somebody better?
Oh, so your question is, why do people continue to invest in
Broken
dysfunctional
relationships, bad investments, broken relationships?
Okay, well, I think there's a couple of reasons. One is one that I think that Adam was mentioning earlier, is that people can become addicted to even dysfunctional relationships. In fact, it might be easier to become addicted to dysfunctional relationships on some level. And that dysregulation that occurs in the withdrawal and the satisfaction of that craving creates a very powerful bond between two people. We commonly call that a trauma bond. It's also difficult because of the sunken cost fallacy. People think of all of the time and energy that they've put into this one relationship. They've built a story together, such as it is. And the idea that you're going to leave that all behind, maybe after 10 years, and go back to the dating market and say, hey, I'm Orion. I'm a psychologist. I was born in Las Vegas. Like, starting from ground zero is really tough. It's really tough. And at a certain point, it doesn't make sense. Like, imagine that you've been involved in a relationship for 40 years. Like, you'll never have another 40-year relationship, for better or for worse, right? And so the idea of starting over at that stage of life with the available suitors in the sexual marketplace might be more distasteful than the current relationship they find themselves in. It might be a dysfunctional relationship, but it's their dysfunctional relationship.
And to that, I'll add the people I see that maintain their stuck emotions. A lot of the women who watch with anxious attachment style in particular, they have a distinct trauma of, my options are excessively limited. I couldn't get new caregivers. I just learned to make do. Then they go into a relationship and they're thankful to have been adopted essentially by this other person. And they just say, this is the only person I can get. I am grateful to have them. If I lose them, I may never connect to anyone ever again. So it's this incredible scarcity their brain has created from infancy.
Yeah, it's probably not true, especially if you're dealing with younger women. But yeah, that is the lie that mentality tells those folks. Absolutely.
Which skews the transaction wildly, because then this is the only dealer on the planet. You can only deal with them. They have a full monopoly on everything. Now the transaction is vastly skewed.
You can think of it like supply and demand. If I'm the only one selling, then I can kind of dictate my price. And if you're the only one buying, you can dictate the price. So healthy negotiations, they depend on competition and transparency. They depend on optionality. Somebody who doesn't have any other options for a relationship is very easily taken advantage of, when we're consciously or not. Like, you sense the desperation in the other person, and it takes a very strong will, a virtuous will, and a conscious will not to exploit that to some degree.
And with an anxious person, it's even worse, because they say, if I lose you, I could die. I will simply wither up and die. So not only do I have no other options, but even being alone isn't an option. I must be with somebody, and you are my only choice. So do whatever you will.
Yeah, in the work that we're doing with Adam, we're building out a framework for negotiations and relationships, and there's 4 levels of negotiations that we're defining. The first one, the absolute most ground level one, is forceful negotiation, which is basically just an ultimatum. Hey, this or this. This is what you're talking about. Then from there, we take a step up, where it's leverage based, where you say, hey, if you do this for me, I'll do this for you. This is classical transactionality. You go a step up, you're dealing with manipulative. This is more insinuation, implication, not necessarily manipulative in a bad way, but somebody you don't trust. It is the absence of trust, trying to get something out of somebody you want that is definitive.
Concealing parts of the transaction, for example.
Being kind of a little shady. And then the apex is what we're defining as persuasive negotiation, where you're actually playing with all your cards on the table. And that's that open transactionality of, hey, let's make this a win-win-win. Win for you, win for me, win for the relationship. Unfortunately, for people who don't understand their own value, I don't think they can play that ladder properly. Do you think that's accurate?
I think it's a really fascinating scheme that you guys are extrapolating over there. I talk about that in the book, not the framework. The framework is really interesting, but that all relationships pass through 3 distinct phases: attraction, negotiation, and maintenance. Whether that happens in a single evening or for the rest of one's life. I think that negotiation is the hardest one to sell people on some level, ironically. Like, people understand attraction, they understand maintenance, relationships take work, but they don't consciously experience themselves as negotiating in their relationships. And I think that's because the vast majority of negotiation in relationships occurs non-verbally, it occurs behaviorally, and it occurs tacitly. So that's the one thing that I would add to your potential framework, because except for manipulation, it seems like the other 3 are very explicit. And I do think the vast majority of negotiation occurs in relationships implicitly.
I get asked all the time, what is my attachment style? What is my attachment style? What is my attachment style? So I have finally launched the attachment assessment. This is not a short quiz that just spits out an answer after 3 seconds. This is a thorough, in-depth, science-backed assessment. Check it out on my website, adamlanesmith.com, and learn your attachment style, the severity of what you're dealing with, and some next steps you can take right now to build very secure attachment.
Yeah, we think it occurs implicitly because there's actually a process and a filter for how this communication happens. Because originally, if we're starting, if I have a need, that need is subconscious. I am, for example, afraid. I need safety. There's a need, for example, for hunger, right? By the time that it actually hits my conscious and I actually understand what it is, it already could be different. So I define it as something. But then by the time it gets to the point where I'm starting to try to figure out how to express it, it's already getting filtered through what we're defining as Adam's attachment styles, or just the attachment styles themselves. This is what I think I am. This is what I belong. This is what the other person wants from me. Then it gets washed through your context, which is what you know about the other person. And then only then does it actually get expressed. But even when it gets expressed, by the time that it hits the other person and it actually goes through their nervous system, it sees if it triggers the amygdala based on how you said it. Then by the time it goes through their attachment filter, their understanding of context, and it gets to their actual, conscious center of their brain, that's now perceived intent. And those 2 are very, very different. Your original intent versus the perceived intent. That's why we think so much negotiation isn't done in the form of actual negotiation at that 4th level, which should be persuasive. I mean, if you're in a relationship, why are you in a relationship where somebody's going to be hurting you? But instead is often perceived as such by that specific process.
That sounds really smart. Yeah, it's not a very simple or straightforward process to negotiate. It goes back to your question earlier about knowing what it is that you want or need. And that's a whole process intrapsychically, and it gets filtered through the dynamic of the relationship and the context of the conversation, and then gets filtered through the intrapsychic levels of the receiving party. So it's very complex for sure. And I think it's also scary. It's because the deeper the need or the desire, the more it's going to hurt if it's frustrated or mocked. And so it's also more satisfying if I don't have to ask. And I know this is an age-old problem in relationships, because if I have to ask you for something, how do I know you're giving it to me because you want to give it to me, or because you just want, I just told you to do, and you're doing what I want? It's like, I want you to want me. It's not enough that you want me. You have to want me, or else the whole thing kind of falls apart. And that leads, of course, to some relational dead ends where one party, usually the woman, says, well, I just want you to kind of know what it is that I want. And I think that's a cop-out. And I think that's a way for her to get around the risk and the insecurity and the vulnerability in identifying and expressing those needs. But I can understand where she's coming from, in that it's more satisfying to have our needs invisibly satisfied without our asking for them, even proactively, because on some level, that's what good mothering is. That's what the good mother anticipates when the baby will be hungry, when the baby is tired, and meets those needs before it starts to cry. And I think that attitude is, on some level, infantile and narcissistic. But it still has its place in the human psychology, because we don't always grow up entirely, right?
No, no, definitely infantile in many ways, and infantile also because we don't want to have that self-conscious observation, because that pause of whatever experience you're having, and then having to intrinsically, first of all, look at your needs, then have to go through an assessment of whether or not those needs are reasonable, and then whether or not those needs are adequate to be asked, then having to formulate and receiving a response. That's a huge distraction from the game that you're playing in the moment. And especially if you're hooked on a lot of positivity hormones, right? If you're really enjoying your current dopamine high, then having to pause and be that self-conscious and self-aware just kind of kills the vibe for a lot of people.
And I'll say this. I think that well, I know that usually when women say, I want you to do it, and because you want to, a lot of times, 100%, it is a cop out of, I don't feel like I should have to, I'm scared to admit it, blah, blah, blah. But the healthier women who say that with more secure attachment, what they're really saying is, I want demonstrable proof that you are experiencing an oxytocin bond to me, because now that means you're less likely to walk away from me, so it makes me feel emotionally safe. So I want you to be embodying addiction toward me. I want to see that you are addicted toward me. Mothers flood with oxytocin from breastfeeding, from birth, everything. That oxytocin is what drives them to then anticipate the needs of the children. She's asking for proof that he's oxytocin bonded is really what she's doing. But again, that's addiction. I want you to be addicted to me, and prove it by reading my mind.
And that's interesting, because I think that when a woman is demanding that evidence, it's generally because she's no longer feeling emotionally addicted. And you see this a lot, is that the needs change as a function of attraction. Like the things that a wife of 10 years complains about with her husband are not the things that were even remotely on her mind in the initial courtship process. On some level, she might have just been happy to be there. But now it's not enough because he leaves the dishes in the dishwasher. So it's like, would a woman who is experiencing a high degree of emotional limerence and attraction really concern herself with the dishes? And if the conversation exists on that level, the man with his rational mind might think, oh, woman dissatisfied because dishes. Therefore, if I put the dishes in the dishwasher the right way, then problem will be resolved. And that's not usually the case, is that picking smaller and smaller problems in your relationship is functionally a sign that I'm not feeling as attracted. Because when we're feeling very highly attracted, we're compensated just by being in the presence of the person that we're attracted to. That's enough. When we don't have that, we need other things. So that's why I say that all men pay, but the more she likes you, the greater the discount.
To that, I will add the bonding hormones that we experience. They act like shock absorbers. So all the little stressors, even if the dishes are a problem, they're not a problem when she is fully satisfied and joyful in the relationship. She just laughs and says, "Oh, that guy, he left the dishes again." When her oxytocin is low, it's, "I wish he was dead. He left the dishes in here again."
Well, sure. Yeah, most therapists know that the things that couples are arguing about are not really what they're arguing about, but it's hard to see that when you're wrapped up in that dynamic yourself.
100%.
When we work, one thing we talk about a fair amount is social currency now. The idea of social currency being what? We all have our needs. And if those needs are tied to attachment specifically, so there could be needs for security, there could be needs for safety, but there could also be needs for attention, for resources, for intent, for satisfaction, for validation, for trust, for knowledge, for all those things. And that's just outside of even relationships. That's also affecting your business relationships. It's affecting every single connection that you have. If you can have a clear understanding of those needs and you can have an understanding of how much of that need is minimum, how much is satisfactory, and how much of that is ideal, you can have a much healthier relationship. So we just recently had a retreat, an attachment retreat. We had about 20 people come out and spend about 3 days with us. And we did an assessment of those. So people would actually have to rate themselves on what is it they want and how much of it that they want from their partner. Now, one thing that I think we'll notice is that there is a difference between people who want the minimum, and that's all they expect, and people who want more than the other person have just to prove they'll give them everything. So that's been something we've noticed is starting to pop out a little bit more in just practice, Adam's practice and whatnot. There seems to be a difference between people who are rational in their expectations and irrational being irrational in their perspective, wanting too much, but also too little.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, what'd you call it? Social currency?
Social currency, yeah.
We could say that that's a complicated construct. I think that some of those things are more ego driven than a deep emotional need. But if I'm going to be like, take the most generous interpretation of those things for knowledge and attention, and I would call it, let's say, an orientation towards growth or a growth mindset. And some people have that and some people don't. And I think it's very important to suss out who you're dealing with as quickly as possible, because a mismatch here is as difficult to navigate as, say, between an extrovert and an introvert. It's not impossible, but it does take a lot of tolerance and understanding and potentially having more parallel lives than you might otherwise desire. So, for example, I did a recent consultation with a guy. He's a go-getter. He's an entrepreneur. He's a hustler. And he's trying to make it work with a woman who just wants to like buy a little house somewhere and have babies. And why does he still need to make money? He has enough money. Why does he still need to be working? Why isn't this little family dream enough? And those two people are just not on the same page, as I advised him. And I think it might be difficult for them to navigate that, because it's difficult to compromise when people are too disparate in their visions. It's like you can't have half a kid. You can't have half of a picket fence. That's a useless fence. So, she wants to live in the country and, raise some kids on a small farm, and he wants to live in the city and make his fortune. That's going to take a great deal of tolerance and communication and understanding, which are all expensive. And people have on some level in limited quantities because it takes patience and energy to deploy them. It's so much easier and on some level satisfying to get involved with people who are already pointed in the same direction as us. So we don't have to spend so much time defining definitions and talking about the relationships. And it's like all of those things take time and energy away from what the relationship is ostensibly designed to accomplish.
The principles component, that's one thing that you talk about a lot, Adam, is during the early stages is defining, do you guys have the same principles and do you guys have the same vision for each other? Because I guess everything starts constructing around that. What is so important to you looking to invest time into building it?
Well, there are, for the people at home that are listening to this, thinking what is included in a transaction, there are thousands upon thousands upon thousands of things that a person could want from another person. It could be, when I am around you, my nervous system is very calm. Emotional safety is what we would call that. It could be, you are the best suitable partner to help me build this life vision and co-create it together. Me and my wife have that. It could be, when I am near you, you bring me so much success and so many solutions. It could be the depth of friendship, right? That is still a transaction that we're experiencing. So yes, 100%. These don't have to be ugly things that we're transacting. It doesn't have to be sex for cash, like people will think when they, with Dr. Orion. I think that's what they hear when they hear transactionality. They think sex for cash. It's, I will give you warmth and connection and help you craft this legacy you're wanting to build, and in return, I want the same. That is a transaction.
Yeah, yeah. It's very clear to use prostitution as an example of transactional relationships because it's so stark. But people, I don't talk about money. I don't say that the transaction in heterosexual sexual relationships is the man exchanging money for sex. It's resources, broadly defined. And resources can be a sense of security. It could be a, a, a therapeutic ear. It could be attention. It could be excitement. These are all things that people pay for through various products and services. So those things are transactable. And on the whole, people will enter into sexual relationships to secure those types of resources. I mean, it's just kind of, it's so obvious, but like men will do things for the woman that he at least wants to have sex with that he won't do for anybody else. He might love his friends, but he's not going to buy his friends a house. He might love his family, but he's not going to pay for all of their meals, et cetera, et cetera. So it's like men will do all kinds of things for the women that they want to have sex with. And that's kind of like the reason why she's there in his life on some level. It's not the only reason, because then we have prostitution, but it's certainly a part of the equation.
100%. It all fits together. And if anyone thinks it doesn't, we look at all of the women on this channel say, I shouldn't have to feel emotionally unsafe. And you're right. I want emotional intimacy. That's one of the biggest concerns we hear on this channel, emotional intimacy.
And you can buy that. I'm sorry to interrupt, but like that, you can get that from a therapist. And that's why so many women have long-term relationships with their therapists.
That is female prostitution, almost, is therapy in some fashions.
It's validation and understanding, and women will pay a premium for that.
It is. And many, 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 many married women that I work with, they say, I will not have sex with my husband until he starts providing emotional intimacy. That is a transactional way of thinking. And many of them would be horrified to even hear that they're thinking that's described that way. But that is a transaction. There is a price on sex in that relationship. It happens to be emotional intimacy, which is more tolerable than cash typically, but that is a transaction. That's exactly what we're talking about here today. And the negotiation of that, how much intimacy is required for this transaction, that's a negotiation piece, and it should be open and explicit.
It's tough, though, because it's like the more explicit the transaction, the more it feels like prostitution. And that's something that most people in long-term relationships want to avoid. They want to feel like this is an emergent thing that we're just doing because of our feelings and the love that we have for each other. And the more we make it an explicit quid pro quo, the more it feels like they feel like it cheapens the relationship.
Quid pro quo, yes, but also if the person is paying the minimum for it, if the person is paying in generosity and saying, by giving this to me, I have capacity to give more to you, so here is an abundance instead of me getting the minimum, that seems to be a big key.
Yeah, there's a variable resource issue to be considered. So let's say if the price of sex today was 5 units of whatever it is, 5 units of attention gets you 1 sex today, and then 5 units of attention gets you 1 sex tomorrow. Would you not assume that in day 10 of the same transaction, you would be ready with your 5 units of attention, but all of a sudden it doesn't get you that? Because your partner is on her period, or maybe she's tired, or maybe something else has changed. This is part of the reason why we don't try to disclose pricing, because you get used to it, and you get used to it pretty fast, and then you demand. So I wouldn't want to share my pricing for affection necessarily as openly, especially if that's something the other person needs all the time, because that price is variable based on the amount of resource I have.
So hiding your pricing as leverage and power.
But the pricing is revealed in the behavior and what we agree to. So that's why I said that most of the negotiation occurs behaviorally and tacitly. So it's a great example, Andre, because in the beginning of the courtship process, that's functionally what the man and the woman are trying to negotiate is, how much do I have to give you to have sex? Like, how much time do you need? How much understanding do you need? How much effort do I have to put into the date? How much money do I have to spend? Oh, you're an old-fashioned girl, so you need 3 of those dates. You need 5 of those dates. It's like, and on some level, that becomes the anchor point for the sexual intimacy. And make no mistake, the guy is there because he wants to have sex. Like, that's why he's taking this woman out and listening to her stories and buying her drinks and whatnot. So the question on some level is, how much do I have to give to get access to your body? And a lot of men, if they could get that more cheaply, would, for better or for worse, would agree to that transaction. And so that's what's kind of being negotiated in the early stages of a courtship, is how much resource do I have to expend to access how much and what quality of sexual opportunity? And then, of course, that changes over time. And that gets, so that's also a point I make in the book, is that negotiation isn't something that you talk about explicitly once at a dinner table. It's something that's constantly renegotiated behaviorally over the course of a relationship. And if the woman starts, and this is one of the chronic dissatisfactions of men, is that as the relationship progresses, they actually invest far more resources than they ever had. In the beginning, it was just like a couple of drinks, and then they got a night of passion. Now he bought her a car, he gave her a wedding, he's taking care of the mortgage payments, and he gets less sex than he ever had. But that happens slowly over time. Like, the price of that woman's sexual opportunity got renegotiated behaviorally, and the guy kind of like just went along with it, which on some level is a tacit consent that I'm okay with this exchange. And then, 10 years later, they're calling me up and say, Orion, I haven't had sex in a year. How did this happen? Well, this is how it happened. It got renegotiated right under your nose.
So, but at the same time, has there potentially been a conversion? Because let's say if they have been married for 10 years and she's provided security, stability, exclusivity, care, right? Care being a big one, children, child rearing, support of other types. Can we not say that some of the resources he's invested originally into sex have now been converted into other types of resources, which if he ignores, he's kind of not having a fair assessment of that transaction?
It's possible, but I think that, some things, I think some things like sleep, like food, like sex, they need to be exchanged regularly, or else it dysregulates the individuals involved. So it's like no compensation after a week is enough for not having food. So you could put me in a palace. You could say that you could put me on a throne. I could have every delicious entertainment for my eyes and my ears available. I could be in total comfort and luxury, but eventually I'm gonna want some food, and I'll trade all of that for some food. And that's because we are in these animal bodies still. And I think that there is a need for sex, especially in men, that is very deep, and that we exchange it for other things, sometimes at our own detriment.
It's basically not understanding then what is it exactly that you need, right? So the reason why people trade it away so willingly is because they're either not conscious about their own needs or they're ashamed of them. And this is a common issue that a lot of men have, and there is stigma for sure in relationships about negotiating in good faith a proper sexual relationship with your partner.
It's very difficult. I'm sorry to interrupt, because it's reminding me of a personal experience that I had many years ago, where I was casually dating a girl for a few months, and she said, okay, well, I want to make things exclusive. And I told her, okay, I'm open to that idea, and I would want to have sex every day. Like, we're not having sex every day, but if you're going to be my exclusive sex dealer, I want to have sex with you every single day. And she got just so offended by that explicit declaration of need that she just stormed out. I never heard from her again. She was offended. She thought that it was so base and crass that I would even care about that kind of thing in an exclusive sexual relationship, which is what she was pitching. So, dodged a bullet on that one potentially. But my point is that it's not so easy to talk about these things explicitly.
I will say that the people that can't talk about these things explicitly are the ones we should be avoiding in the relationships. I think that actually could be an interesting compatibility factor, is only connecting to the people who are willing to have more explicit conversations. Not that they're 100% fully comfortable and have no emotional response, but at least that they can manage their nervous system enough to recognize and say, okay, tell me more. Sex once a day, what does that look like? For me to have full capacity, okay, I want an exclusive relationship. You're saying sex once a day. For me to be able to fully provide that, I need the oxytocin that will drive my libido. Can you also be taking care of that for me? And then what can I do on the other end? Okay, you also want me to do your laundry for that. Let's go back and forth. Whatever it is, we build a negotiation that makes sense. That's the only way to really long-term have a satisfying monogamous bond that actually is fulfilling. Otherwise, it ends up as suffering for one or both.
So I'm curious, Dr. Orion, just for that specific example, would there have been any case where you would have settled for slightly less, where you maybe been going a little high in the negotiation and you would have been okay with 5 days a week, maybe not 7?
Was he highballing her?
Maybe.
You're asking?
I'm not sure, because at the time, because we were dating casually and non-exclusively, I was having sex every day, just not with her. And so the idea that I was going to leave the diversity of that experience and the optionality is that I want at least as much as I currently have. I think that's generally how people accept offers. It's like, if you're going to recruit me, you have to pay me at least as much as I'm currently making, or else it's going to be a very tough sell. Like, that would have to be some sort of passion project and dream job where I would be willing to jump ship for less.
So it was a fair and equal offer.
Yeah, fair and equal offer. And of course, the more optionality somebody has, the higher the offer you likely have to give to be persuasive. Like, you see that with the top athletes. If everybody wants to sign with that guy, he can pretty much dictate his price.
So I guess the reason why people get offended is sometimes they believe their own price is significantly higher than it is.
Oh, sure.
Maybe that's part of the problem too. Then how do you actually know your real market price then, Dr. Ryan?
Back to the book.
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. It's in the book. So I have a whole chapter on the sexual marketplace value, because it's a very contentious and misunderstood topic. And so I actually split it up into 3 different types of value. And to answer your question, I think it's the third type that speaks most directly to that objective value, which I call transacted sexual marketplace value. It's like that athlete, no one really knew how much that athlete's talent was worth until he signed the contract for $500 million, at which point he was worth $500 million. You might argue that he should have been worth less, but he could get $500 million, so he was worth $500 million. If he got $300 million, he'd be worth $300 million. If he got $800 million, he'd be worth $800 million. So it's when everything is just hypothetical until money changes hands on some level. Then we actually know exactly what something is worth. And so transacted sexual marketplace value looks at the type of people and the quality of relationships that you've been able to attract in the past on some level. And that's, I think, the closest metric that we have to where somebody might reside in the sexual marketplace.
Okay. Well, let's say then you had a bad history of relationships. You were anxious, for example, especially as a man an anxious man might have been intentionally picking low value, low effort partners. You've gone through your work, you've gone to the gym, worked with Dr. Orion, you worked with Adam, you're good to go now. Technically, your price has gone up. You've upgraded. How do you know your price now if all of your past relationships have not been to your best quality?
Yeah, I mean, I do talk about how you kind of average it from the most recent relationships in the past, but which would be skewed in this example, right? But to continue on with the transacted sexual marketplace value, so the guy's made some improvements. So how much has he improved? Well, we don't really know until we see how bad of a woman he could pull on some level. So like, what kind of woman is he now attracting with his self-development? Is she more physically beautiful? Is she more stable? Is she giving him more of what he wants and less of what he doesn't? In which case we can say that he has increased his value in the eyes of his audience.
An auction, in essence.
Because it's exactly. The milk,
$10,
the cat decides,
$12.
The cat decides what milk is good. The cat decides what milk is good. You can't say, I went to the gym 4 times a week for 4 years, so therefore I'm this much much higher in the sexual marketplace. It's like, it's for the women to decide that in the heterosexual auction. And it's for the men to decide that on the women. And that makes people very uncomfortable. They'd like to be able to dictate their own price.
Well, there's a lot of content that is out there. In order to get into the headspace of improving yourself, you have to intrinsically see your own future value. and try to pursue your own future value in order to create some real world value. But that's kind of a bit of a chicken and egg problem, right? If you don't believe you're worth anything better than you are, you're not going to go for it. But if you do believe something that that you can be better than you are, when you do go for it, how do you know that you're not overshooting? So that's kind of that delicate balance people have.
I just bought a home 6 months ago. Oh, it's been a year actually. My goodness, time has flown. Thank you. But we had to get it appraised. We had to look around at what the other value of the homes in our area were, but also what similar homes were, and blah blah blah. And I think in the market we can see very clearly what certain people are willing to pay, especially types of people who are looking for certain things. You look for your target audience and you look for what they're currently paying, and you price yourself there, just like marketing a product.
That's why there's matchmakers.
The market isn't perfect, but it's probably the best that we got. So if you're trying to sell a house and you haven't gotten a single offer in a year, you're selling that too high. It's worth less than you think it is. Like, the market is giving you feedback. And if you put a house on a market and immediately you're inundated with 50 cash offers, you could have charged a lot more than you currently did. And you're going to come back and say, whoa, 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 we've gotten so much. And what's your the most rational response to that kind of feedback? You raise your price. And so people figure out a way through interacting with the market where they kind of reside. And we know that to be the case because of what do they call it? Affiliative dating, is that people generally end up with folks of the same basic attractiveness.
Okay, that's interesting. We actually have a lot of our audience members who are single, or they're separated and they're kind of those transition stages. And it really is confusing to a lot of them based on their past relationships, what their actual market value is. That is a huge, huge issue for a lot of women who are recently out of relationships, but also a huge issue for a lot of men, especially if those transactional relationships they were present in their past connection were not fair. Or at least they felt they were not fair. So what do you suggest then they do? Do they go to the bar and try to see, out of 10 women, which one they attract?
On some level, yeah, you got to put it on the market. So what I was talking about in examining their past relationships, that's kind of like a comparable, which is how a realtor establishes a valuation for a house before it goes on market. It's a hypothetical. It's our best guess before we actually receive feedback from the market. And I stick with that. I do think that the quality of our previous relationships is probably our best guess, but maybe our best guess is wrong. And when we put the house on the market, we appreciate the feedback that we're receiving based on our prediction. And so on some level, you can't know where you stand until you put yourself out there. And I think that might be why a lot of folks are delusional today, because they're not really putting themselves out there as much as they used to.
Yeah.
Especially on dating apps, they're siloed away. And dating apps are creating an enormous difficulty in the sexual marketplace these days. Because just think about it psychologically. If I'm a man on a dating app, I think that I'm the only man, because I don't see any of my intrasexual competition on the app. I'm the only man, and I'm dealing with an apparently infinite supply of women. So I am the only show in town within my subjective experience. And so if men are fundamentally exchanging resources for sexual opportunity in the sexual marketplace, and I think that I'm the only buyer, and there's an infinite supply of sellers, I think there's always going to be someone out there that I can transact for that opportunity more cheaply. And that gives rise to fuckboys, which is basically like, I want to put in the minimum amount of effort and access the most sexual opportunity as I possibly can. And if you're not going to give it to me, it's like a global economy. I know there's somebody who's going to work for $3 an hour somewhere. And that's what happens. By the same token, it's completely reversed for the woman. She sees herself siloed away from all other women, so she has no intrasexual competition, and she's dealing with an endless supply of men who seem to be very eager to access her sexual opportunity. So she's the only seller, and she's dealing with an infinite supply of buyers. So why doesn't she raise her price as much as possible? So this is why on the profiles, before you even talk to the girl, she's like, I'm looking for a committed relationship. I want a life partner. It's like, oh my God. It's like, hey, how you doing? What's your name? So they're coming in with these enormous asks, versus on the other side, the men are saying, well, there's somebody out there that's going to do this job more cheaply. And what she's saying is that in that same economy, I can pretty much dictate my price because I'm the only show in town. And so the valuation is getting further and further away. And so men increasingly think that women are like delusional lunatics and they don't read the writing on the wall. And women think of men that they're just like these unscrupulous cads and they just sort of like want to get sex for free.
It's like a double blind auction, because at the end of the day, you actually don't know what you buy. So let's say in that Tinder type of connection, this the online dating thing, eventually you've been swiping, you've been talking to 100 different partners. You have to make a choice, right? And then the other person has to make the choice. And say that you guys have both chosen yourselves. You've chosen yourselves entirely on a misconception and a misassumption of your own values, and then you connect in real life, in a restaurant, in a coffee shop, in the bedroom, whatnot, and then there's almost like this readjustment, like the unwrapping experience of what actually did I buy for what price, and there's just such a weird, lack of a better term, cluster.
Yeah, and that might be inevitable on some level, because what makes for good long-term partners, like what works in the maintenance phase, doesn't work in the attraction phase. And if you don't get the job if you don't get the interview, on some level. Like patience is not sexy. Kindness is not hot. So the things that might make for good long-term partners don't attract in the initial stages of the courtship process. So and you throw in there a lot of bad actors. You got manipulative folks on both sides who are just trying to get what they want as much as they can while they still can. It's like late stage capitalism. So we're just going to get while the getting's good on some level. And we're talking about what you just described. I discuss in the book as the crisis of disillusionment, which is that after sort of the limerence and the attraction wears off, you finally get to see the person more or less as they truly are. And this is a really difficult but necessary obstacle for any relationship to overcome, because you're probably not that invested at this point. This typically happens in the first 6 to 12 months. So maybe you jump ship, and people do that. Oh, I don't feel the same way. It's not you, it's me. And they chase the spark somewhere else, right? But the idea here is you weren't who I thought you were. Maybe that was because you were manipulating me. Maybe it's just because it's a job interview and you were trying to put your most attractive, best foot forward. But now I'm seeing more of who you truly are. Now I have to make a decision whether there's enough in reality in you and in our dynamic to go the distance. And that's when the relationship truly begins, because up until that point, you were just in a relationship with a fantasy, a projected reality. And now you're maybe seeing the person for the very first time, and they're seeing you.
But then also at the same time, if you are able to project forward and know what you're going to be needing at that 10-year, 20-year, 40-year relationship mark, then the attributes that initially weren't sexy, like the patience, the kindness, the attentiveness, they all of a sudden become very valuable. So if you were initially attracted to, say, beauty and sexuality and whatever it was, as you do progress through that relationship, there is that pivot point where can I see myself with this person for a very long time?
I hear you, but it's tough. That's why it's so difficult to stay together, I think, for the long term, is that those sorts of things, they feel like rocking chair love to me, man. That they feel like, companionate love after all the passion has died and we're in nursing homes and we're holding hands. It's like the sweet love that we think between grandma and grandpa. And I'm not ready for that shit yet. And a lot of people aren't ready for that either. Now, there will come a time when their needs and tastes shift, most likely, but it's not today. So am I going to forego my needs and wants for the next 40 years in favor for maybe if I get to 80, maybe if I'm still alive, and maybe if we go to the distance, she's going to be a good person to ride out the sunset with. It's very difficult. And so for better or for worse, people find their most pressing needs and desires more urgent to satisfy. And so there is a bias towards that kind of short-term need satisfaction.
The addiction
because he knows
cycle,
if I'm going to
yes.
get to the end. What was that?
The addiction cycle, yes. Going back to the beginning of the conversation, we want to keep feeding that, but eventually we're going to have to get off that train, right? Eventually, if you want to have a family, that's something that you're going to have to decide. And eventually that the chase, the spark is going to have to be sacrificed, at least in some ways, for the long-term stability.
Yeah, and I think that people reach that point in their own time, and kind of suggesting that people are going to do it before that they're emotionally ready to do it for whatever reason. Sometimes that works, and sometimes it just delays the breakup. And people, the guy has the midlife crisis because he foreclosed on those things too early in his perception. And so it just gets deferred.
Withdrawal, right? He hits a withdrawal to a drug that he was not ready to get off of, right? Or he didn't sufficiently plan the withdrawal for, right? He didn't really plan for the other supporting things that he needed to get over the gap, and then he relapses. And we see that a lot with avoidant men, especially.
Sure. And so it's just difficult. The needs and wants of the two individuals will organically, developmentally change, and they also change the function of being satisfied. And so it's extremely difficult to stay together because on some level, the person I am today is not the person I was 10 years ago. It's difficult for me to know exactly what I'm going to need and want 40 years from now. So how do I really plan for that? I certainly couldn't when I was 20. Maybe I can do it now that I'm 40 because I've lived 40 years and I kind of know what 40 years feels like. But I would be you if I told you I knew what that felt like at 20. So to expect that I would be able to use sufficient judgment to do so was just beyond me personally. Maybe some 20-year-olds can do it, but I sure as hell couldn't.
Well, there has to be a certain degree of indoctrination of self and also from others to believe that at 20. So there's people out there who get told that this is what you need and this is what you want, and they believe that and they live those lives out, and some of them succeed and some of them don't, in religious communities and cultural communities, and some of them are really happy. They never had the issue of having to go to market.
And I think that that's the correct term to use, for better or for worse, is indoctrination. And,
Yes.
and maybe that is necessary. And we certainly know that some people can live satisfying lives and have satisfying relationships within that doctrination. But we also see sort of a global swing away from that in the last 100, 150 years, which is, you see it all the time potentially in those who are raised in a very strict religious household. As they get to their adulthood, when they're able to kind of have more critical thought and make their own decisions, and they violently break away from their religions, even when there might be a lot in that path that could serve them. Like it's a reactance that forces them to assert their autonomy and independence. And so I don't know what's the right thing to do. Certainly we can think that relationships and marriage are mimetic. Like we might need to see other people doing them. We might need to hear other people talking about them to want them. And there might not be a lot of good models that are visible to people for those things today. And so we could call that kind of mimetic presentation indoctrination, but it comes at a cost. But so does not indoctrinating. So it's sort of like pick your poison.
Yep. Well, so far, I got to say that the sellers of marriage and long-term relationship and monogamy have not been doing a great job at marketing. So far, that value appears to be very low on the market, and the value of immediate gratification that comes from being much more open is much higher because it's also what's advertised. So I think that's definitely a very fair point, because it's a question of what is it that is being sold and marketed. Is it cool to live in a townhouse? Should you live in the country? Should you live in a condo? What's cool now is kind of changing with the times, for sure. Now, I'm kind of curious because I know we're starting to run out a little bit of time, but I'd love to get into this topic. We talked about singles. We talked about, people recently broken up. What about people in relationships which have started off with a bad economy? I'll give you an example. A lot of our audiences and a lot of our followers, they're in bad relationships. Once they don't want to leave, but they're bad relationships, bad transactions. So let's say if I was speaking for a woman who was in their mid stages of dating, maybe dating for a year, wants to move towards engagement, but she feels like she transacted sex too early, and now that has been devalued, and now she's trying to bring that relationship back and turn that around. How do you fix a relationship with a broken transaction system?
It's very hard to do. It needs, especially the longer that bad transaction has been in play, like the longer it's been established as a routine, it sets a precedent, both like behaviorally and emotionally for both parties. So if something had been going on for years, it might take at least a year to change. And it will be risky to change because what is a problem for her might not be a problem for him, per se. In fact, she might believe that she transacted sex too early, but if she had waited, he might not be there. Now, you might say, well, maybe that's for the best, but she didn't think so at the time. So that's one thing to consider. The second thing to consider is I don't often believe in bad transactions. Like if a transaction is too disparate, it doesn't occur. So to give an example about that reminds me of my own life. So when I was younger, I got involved with a lot of very dramatic and unstable women. I was an actor. I dated a lot of actresses. We're not known for our emotional stability. And I would think it would just be chaos, some of these relationships. And I would think, well, I'm giving so much and I'm getting nothing in return. Like that, in my mind, I thought that it was a bad transaction, right? Maybe this woman is feeling similarly, but that wasn't entirely true. But as long as I felt like that was true, it kept me in that dynamic. What helped me break out of that dynamic was to understand and appreciate how deeply I had a need for excitement, to feel like somebody was a problem so that I could solve that problem, which helps me feel useful and reassured, which was a big part of my ego identity. That I hated boredom, that these women, even though they were crazy and unpredictable, they at least, there was never a dull moment with them. So they were meeting a lot of needs that I wasn't willing to consciously accept for a while. And that kept me in this bad dynamic because I kept seeing her as the problem. She was potentially just, I was giving and giving and she was just taking and taking and taking. And that doesn't actually happen in reality, is that people who truly give and give and give and don't receive anything in return generally don't stick around. So what I would say is for this woman to become more conscious of what she might be getting in exchange in this relationship. And it may not be very pleasant for her to admit some of those things that she's receiving. But the more conscious that she is of those needs, the more she could potentially get them satisfied in other ways. And it might empower her to take some of her own like agency back and not just saying that I'm the victim of this bad transaction.
Yep, sometimes it's very hard to get off the roller coaster that you really, really enjoy, even though it makes you nauseous.
Well, I mean, roller coasters are fun because they're loop-de-loops, and we're out of control. If it was just on a flat plane at a reasonable speed, I don't think anyone would line up to buy tickets.
No, probably not.
Well, it depends what's on display. I mean, It's a Small World is a flat plane, but you get song and dance. So everyone's got a different kind of ride they're on. But I agree 100%. If you are dating the same person over and over and saying, I deserve better, well, you don't want better. You want what you're getting. You're getting something. Be honest with yourself about what you're actually seeking.
And if people really did think that I could get better, they leave. Like, if I really felt that I could sell my labor on the open market for more money, I wouldn't stay at an unsatisfying job where I didn't feel like I was getting paid what I deserved. But sometimes the belief that we could get more if we wanted is enough to satisfy ourselves emotionally in that moment. It's almost like, sometimes have you ever been at a bar and someone's had too much to drink and they get their feelings hurt and they get aggressive and their friends like grab them. And he's like, oh, my friends weren't here. I would fuck you up, man. Hold me back. It's like, yeah, but what if you really took the friends away? Do you really think you would be so aggressive? Do you really? If no one was there to protect you, if no one was there to get your back, it was just you and that guy, you would be just as aggressive as you currently are? I doubt it. So sometimes the things that hold us back make us feel stronger than we truly are.
Yeah, it's true. As in my past life, I remember I was in a bar in Budapest having exactly the same conversation with a drunk British guy. And his first argument, I didn't even know what I did to offend him, but it was something. It was his first argument. Says, he goes, I am here with 26 friends. And I look around, I go, well, where are they? And so does he. And he goes, oh. And then the conversation really de-escalated. That was really interesting. We mostly even got along afterwards. Not for long, but So true. And it is your perception of, your own kind of like intimidation, but also at the same time, your own delusion that really does skew that transaction.
Mhm.
So it almost sounds to me like if you are in that relationship, you kind of need to stop and you need to figure out what is really going on from a transactional standpoint, right? What are you guys exchanging? If you don't like the idea of transactionality, you'll use a social currency model like the one that we talk about, where you say at least this is a little bit, softer and fuzzier if you want. But ultimately, you're still exchanging something. And if you can be honest about what is that you're getting and what is it that you're giving, what is it that you want and what is it that you need, I think at that point, you can have a much clearer explanation of whether or not this is a relationship that's even worth turning around, because not all of them are.
And to be truly honest with yourself about what you think you deserve and what you can get, because people are often misguided with respect to that. Someone who thinks that they're worth a lot more won't even respond to a low ball offer. You know what I'm saying? They just walk. They let their actions speak for their self-worth. When someone says, I'm worth a lot more, that person on some level doesn't truly believe it. That's a communication strategy to get you to see things the way that I would like you to see them. But if I truly felt that, I wouldn't even be having this conversation with such a low ball anchoring.
True, but it also depends on the games the other person's playing, right? Are they playing in those 4 levels of negotiation? Are they being manipulative? Are they overselling? Are they over posturing? Are they over positioning? And maybe you're doing the same thing. That's a tough conversation to have, but it's one that I think is very necessary. What are some good questions to ask to have that?
To see about the transactional pieces.
Yeah.
One thing I like to tell my clients is this, is what would you need from me to want to stay? What would you need from me to want to stay? That's a much better way of saying, how many times a week do I have to have sex with you? What would you need from me? Because there can be character elements in there. There can be trustworthy elements in there. Yes, there can be sex in there. Yes, there can be fidelity in there. There can be so many components. What would you need from me to stay together? And that's ultimately the question every couple needs to really answer. Is if you're the kind of person who dreams of the rocking chair love eventually, but you also don't want to sacrifice passion now, what would you need from me to make it the next 50 years? That's many, many, many long conversations. And if that's what you want, you need to have many, many, many long conversations and figure out the one person who's going to do that with you. If you're looking for the shorter term and you're looking for a phase of life companion, you need to make that very clear as well and have those conversations very quickly with somebody who wants the same thing. But the worst thing you can do is walk into a relationship with one core absolute desire. The other person says, I do not want that. And you say, perhaps I can convince you over time.
Yeah, that happens a lot. I have no problem with anything that you just said, but it does remind me of something that causes a lot of people to price themselves out of the sexual marketplace these days, which is that they want too many things. And I do think that one of the secrets to having satisfying relationships is to want only a few things from your primary partner and to get all those needs and desires met that you can outside of that primary relationship. Takes a lot of their pressure off, because and is expensive. And is expensive. When we say the word and, we're multiplying probabilities, which makes them smaller. So I was talking to a guy the other day. He's married, but he's thinking of leaving his wife, but he wanted my feedback as to what would be the likelihood that he could find what he wanted on the sexual marketplace. So I said, well, do you know what you want? He said, yeah. It's like, that's great. That puts you ahead of most guys. And he says, well, I want a beautiful young woman who is my intellectual equal and I have all kinds of conversations with. I already have kids, so she'd have to be a good stepmother and potentially be open to that kind of blended family. I'd like her to be able to speak Portuguese because I'd like to travel to Brazil. It's like, he listed out 10 things. And I was like, dude, you're not going to find that girl. You're not. And certainly not under any appreciable timeline. Like, she might exist among the 8.5 billion people on the planet, but your likelihood of finding that person in the next 5 years and have her reciprocally be attracted to you is very, very low. So too many people are just focused on what they're looking for. And I do think that a lot of people get that from therapists and self-help gurus these days. It's just like, visualize it, have your vision board for your partner, manifest it. And they're not thinking about the other side, which is, okay, for every ask that I have for my partner, what's the complementary value that I'm going to provide in return? Because if a woman is asking for resources and commitment and sexual exclusivity and legal marriage and cohabitation and the ability to not work and to raise children, it's like, well, those are a lot of expensive things. Expensive not just in terms of money, but in terms of energy, in terms of time, in terms of opportunity. So what are you prepared to offer in return? And that question melts a lot of women's minds. It's almost like, well, what do you mean? What do I bring to the table? I am the table. The table doesn't need to provide anything in return. That's not what this is about. And so it offends sort of like the narcissism or the ego of that person to think that I'm actually exchanging. It's much too many people are just focusing on what they want and not what they can provide. And that's a big part of why relationships are being transacted less frequently these days, is because they're out of touch with one another. Is that people want the moon, but they don't look at themselves and say, could I buy the moon? The moon's worth a lot of money.
That's very true, right? Ultimately, you do have to understand what is it that you offer and be ready to offer it. A lot of people will offer things and then take them back. That also happens. They offer, to stay home with the kids. They offer to, provide for the family. They offer this, and then it gets hard, and they go, you know what? I don't want to do this anymore. Where's the out? Sometimes there is no out, not in that relationship, at least.
Yeah, that can certainly happen. But I do think that if someone is going to really dial in what they want, which is a good thing to do, in the very next breath, they should be able to communicate clearly what they offer. And that offer should be as objective as possible. Like if you're trying to sell a house and part of what you offer is a bathroom with a toilet, it's like, well, all the houses have a bathroom with a toilet. That's not actually a decision-making point. It's like, this car has wheels. Yeah, they all have wheels, man. It's like, that's actually not really that exciting or interesting to me. So you have to really know on some level your market or your competition to know how your product stands out in comparison to the other things on offer, and to know where your quality stands objectively. Everyone thinks that they're smarter, kinder, more patient, more attractive than they truly are. So, and it's easier to think that when you're separated from people, and we're getting more, isolated and alienated from each other with each passing day, it seems.
Yeah. There's an interesting statistic out there that was recently published. And it says that the average man overestimates his competency in a physical fight 4,000%.
4,000%.
4,000%. That's right.
Shit.
They believe they're 40 times more efficient than they actually are, and this is on average. So that just kind of speaks to you around their own understanding of their own, actually direct sexual value, because that's one of the first things that they would probably value themselves on is, how tough, how strong, how protective, how competent you are. And that's already an interesting sign. So there you go. Well, Dr. Ryan, thank you very much for such a wonderful conversation. Part 2, for those of you who haven't actually heard part 1, go back and find it on our channel. It's also been just as awesome. But this is great because it kind of is sobering in many ways, but sobering in a positive way because it ultimately helps you quit the game that you're destined to lose and maybe find a game that you're much more likely to win, which is ultimately what we're all trying to do in life. Which we're not just trying to win, but we're also trying to not lose. So stop trying to play the losing game, find the right market, and provide the right value so you can actually have that long-term relationship or whatever it is that you're looking for at fair market price. And then you won't have to worry about being undersold or taken advantage of. That's kind of my takeaways.
Yeah, well said. These are strategies for success. It's about getting and keeping more of what you want and getting less of what you don't. And it works.
It does. Dr. Ryan, where can we find you to learn more about this?
Oh, sure. So you probably know me through my YouTube channel, Psych Hacks. Everything kind of spins from there. There are links in the descriptions of every episode that take you to my personal website where people can potentially book individual consultations with me, join my member community, sign up for my newsletter, or buy my book, The Value of Others, which we discussed earlier.
Adam, where can we find you?
I'm Adam Lane Smith, the attachment specialist. You can find me on adamlanesmith.com, where I and my team of certified attachment specialist coaches can help you stop having wrong transactions and understand what your actual needs and even offerings are in your relationships. Stop on by.
There you go. Dr. Orion, thank you very much for hopping on. This was very fun. We'll hope to have you on again, and thank you for coming.
Yeah, great conversation, boys. Thanks for having me on.
Till next time, and everybody else, please like, subscribe, and share. Comment your questions for Dr. Orion below. And we'll see you all next episode of I Wish You Knew. Thank you.